So we're going to talk about how, like, the power of imagination, and also explore together how imagination could support everybody here and everybody you work with and civil society as a whole in different ways. And so we're going to explore that together. So I know, Caroline, you asked if I could just say a little bit about my background to start. So I come from quite an unusual background. I started life as a molecular biologist and a scientist, so working in the lab, you know, really pipetting bits of bacteria across and fluids and working with yeah, like bubbling liquids and that sort of classic scientist. But what I think really was the beginning of this journey that has led me to focus so much on imagination, was that when I read about scientists in the past, you know, like natural scientists and kind of the sorts of discoveries that were made in the past by scientists, what was really clear was imagination was a huge part of that. And so this might be a bit of a rabbit hole, but, you know, one of the famous chemists who discovered the structure of the benzene ring, which is a chemical structure, he writes about how the way he discovered that was through having a dream of a snake that caught its own tail. And then he realized it was a circular chemical structure. And so imagination and science and rational and imaginative approaches in the past used to be really united and brought together. But I believe that in the last kind of 200 years of the Industrial Revolution and all of the impact that industrial kind of reductionist society has had on the way that we think, is that there's been a separation between the rational, scientific ways of thinking and the imaginative and artistic. And the imaginative and artistic has been sort of boxed away into a kind of side box and really stripped of its power. You know, I really think we think of art and imagination as something that is fluffy and, you know, it's a nice to have and it's a lovely thing to do on weekends, but it's nothing to do with the kind of main, you know, part of our lives of working and getting things done and really making change. But I think that's not true, and I think we need to bring them back together. So that's just a little bit of where I've come from. So I'll just say a little bit about the organization I run and what we're doing, and then I'll show some slides and videos and hopefully just leave enough time for Georgie, who I think will join us. She's from the Onion Collective. Oh, Georgie's just joined. Brilliant, it's almost on cue. So Georgie's joining us from the Onion Collective. Hi, Georgie, I was just talking about you. Great timing. Who we've done some really exciting work with in Watch It. So it's just really great to have Georgie here to talk about also the amazing work that the Onion Collective are doing and how we work together. But yeah, so I run an organization called Moral Imaginations, and we design spaces and experiences and methodologies, both virtual and in person, that enable collective imagination in order to envision a better world, but also to expand our sense of who we are and explore things like deep time, future generations, a connection to place, a connection to the past. So a bigger sense of what it means to be alive here on Earth. And we use science-based approaches as well as coaching for leaders, and we also use experience design. And I also write and speak widely on the topic of collective imagination. I'll put some links in the chat later on. And the big thing that we're interested in is, how do you work with imagination in a way that we can embed that into organizations, into practice, into place, so that it's not something that you do and then you just stop doing and it goes away. And so the framing for the imagination work within the Better Way Network is within this question of how can we unlock humanity and our imagination. And I really like the way it's framed of our humanity can really build bridges and move us to change. And so collective imagination can make a different future possible. It can it can bring us into better connection with the kinds of futures we want to see. I thought I'd just ask a kind of a provocative question of how often do you feel that you nourish your sense of a better future and an inspiring future? how often do you feel that you do that on a day-to-day basis, and how often do you feel that that happens just as a result of the media you consume and the news that you watch and the kinds of conversations that you take part in? And if you'd like to put any thoughts in the chat, please do, but it was something I was thinking about this morning. So I'm just going to skip forward. So I really feel, often people talk about, oh, we really need to support and boost imagination. But I actually don't feel that the problem is a lack of imagination, it's a block of imagination. So I think we're all born with natural, born capacities to imagine, and anybody with kids will know that it's this kind of boundless imagination that has no constraints, and they can really access a space of forgetting about rules, forgetting about, really rational, like that's not possible. We're not going to play this game because it's totally not realistic or rational. That doesn't happen. And so I feel that as we grow up, as a result of schools and as a result of our workplaces, our imagination gets colonized. So we grow up in schools, in competitive environments where there's one right answer. And if you come up with an answer that's not the right one, you're wrong and you failed. Our schools are based on this kind of rote learning and exams and cookie cutter models of how we're meant to think and what's right and what's wrong. And as we get older, these pressures to perform get larger and larger, and there's a lack of spaces for play. When we think about where do we as adults have space to play and stretch our imaginations, play is something that's constrained to either sports or going to the pub on a Friday night. So where are the places that we can actually stretch our imaginations and play? And more than that, imagination is reserved only for some people in society. So designers, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, film directors. So there's also a bit of a social justice angle to this, of like only some people are really supported and allowed to exercise imagination. And often it's the people higher up, in the kind of corporate ladder, who are allowed to have that space and that input. And so I really feel on a kind, when we talk about existential risk and like the risks that are putting humanity and society on a track to not a positive future, just think about the massive capacity of all those people's imaginations that are not used at all, that are not active, that don't have a platform, that don't have a space. Like if you really think of that collective earth-wide imagination and how little of that is being practiced and exercised, and if you think of it as a muscle, it's atrophied, it's not really being flexed. So really feel we need to decolonize and rewild our imaginations, and the question is how to do that. So a couple of thoughts on that. One is that we need dedicated time and space for creativity and imagination. And there's some really interesting neuroscience around how the brain does thinking in different neural circuits. So there's one neural circuit that lights up in the brain for strategic and linear thinking, and one that lights up for creative, imaginative, exploring and dreaming. So that's really the exploring of things that aren't necessarily rationally possible, but could lead to a very different world, or could lead us to discover innovations that don't seem possible right now. And the interesting thing is that these two neural circuits actually dampen each other down. So when you're thinking in the strategic and linear way, it dampens down the neural circuit in your brain that can do that exploratory, boundless exploration and imagination. And interestingly, that dreamy, imaginative circuit is much more active as a child. And then slowly the other strategic circuit, which is called the default mode network, gets more and more dominant. So we need to create spaces where the other circuit can come back online and flourish. And the second one is we need permission for imagination. We need spaces where there are no need for results. We remove the fear of performing, and we remove the fear of being humiliated or laughed at. So there's a real need for a space where we have permission to just be playful and explore and be silly and not make sense, and actually explore. I think imagination can be a really powerful tool to explore difficult emotions as well, and difficult situations. And maybe we'll come on to talk a bit about that with Georgie within the Imagination Lab that we did. I think as we use imagination to explore the future and future generations, often quite difficult emotions can come up, because actually we start to think, what are we doing and why are we doing this and why am I living my life in this way? So it can often provide quite an interesting way in to tackle quite difficult feelings as well. And lastly, we need help, and we need cues and prompts to access kind of visions and futures and imagination. So what Moral Imaginations does is create these portals and exercises that can help people access otherworldly visions. And imagination is not just a brain thing. I know I talked about the brain, but to truly access our imaginations, we need guidance and practice and relaxing and accessing our bodies and our emotions. So imagination is actually a very emotional and embodied thing. So those are some opening thoughts. I'm just going to share a couple of slides. I'm looking at the time and just thinking, there are a couple of videos I wanted to show as well, just to give you a bit of an illustration. You know, imagination is quite an abstract thing. It's quite hard to get a sense of what that is. And one of the exercises we've produced at Moral Imaginations is something called the Impossible Train Story, which uses the metaphor of a train to tackle the whole situation of the COVID pandemic and the future and what we're going to do. I think probably many of you have seen the Impossible Train Story, but I know, Caroline, you said that it would be great to show that, so I'm happy to do that.